And we are back. Moving on, moving on. All right, so Andrew Jackson. Such an interesting person. So Andrew Jackson did have a typical cabinet, but he actually relied more on a group of friends that he ends up calling the kitchen cabinet. Or, I don't know that he calls them that, other people call him that. So basically it's a small group of advisors who are going to help him make policy, and they literally will meet in the kitchen at the White House. Its most influential members are two Kentuckians. So you have Francis Preston Blair, who's editor of the Washington Globe, and Amos Kendall, who's a speechwriter. Roger B. Taney of Maryland. He is the Attorney General, Treasury Secretary, and then he becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And then Martin Van Buren, who's named Jackson's Secretary of State, and who will eventually become a president as well. Which, again, that's another interesting story. And so he would have conferences with these four men and basically make decisions about what he was going to do based on their opinions and whatnot. Patronage is used to instill party loyalty, because remember, Martin Van Buren is all about kind of building party loyalty. Insisted that his administration's officers rotate positions. So he's going to reward friends at home with government jobs, believing this to be his right as a victor. He opposes government intervention in economic development. So he's going to veto or reject plans for national subsidies of transportation initiatives and internal improvements, including the extension of the national road. So Andrew Jackson is a very, very strict constitutionalist in the sense that there are things he thinks that he is not allowed to do, and this is one of them. He thinks that subsidizing transportation initiatives and whatnot. And this goes really against Henry Clay's American system, because that is one of the policies of it, is kind of including the improving the infrastructure and whatnot. Okay, so 1828 comes along, and you have the Tariff of 1828. Opposition to the tariffs are going to continue in the South, so this is not something that Andrew Jackson puts into place, but he does support it. Okay, it is put into place under John Quincy Adams. So South Carolina is the only state with a black majority, so 56% of their population was basically slaves. They fear rebellion by slaves quite heavily. So slaveholders in South Carolina are going to criticize the tariff. They want lower rates. They want to keep public discussion away from British decision to end slavery in the West Indies in 1833. So they don't want to bring up anything that is going to cause an insurrection with the slaves. So this is just one of the things that's going to contribute to it. The tariff is reenacted in 1832, and that is going to be under Andrew Jackson. South Carolina is going to adopt an ordinance of nullification in November of 1832. So basically, they're going to say these two tariffs are null and void in South Carolina. We don't like them. They don't work for us, so we are just not going to follow them. And they threaten to secede if the government tries to force collection. And secede means leaving the Union. And so we do know that during the Civil War that states do leave the Union. This is an early precursor to it. They don't actually secede in 1832, but they threaten to. They argued that protective tariffs were illegitimate because each state or geographic region had distinct interest. Vice President John Calhoun supported South Carolina. Jackson, he wants a middle ground on this one, but he believes the Constitution gives the federal government the power to establish tariffs, because it does. And it declares South Carolina's ordinance of nullification a violation of the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say states don't have to follow the laws. Jackson is granted power by Congress to use military means to end the standoff with South Carolina if needed. South Carolina is not really interested in doing that. Again, 56% of their population is slaves. And so they are going to back down. But you can see right here, just from this political cartoon, you have nullification, South Carolina ordinance, treason, Civil War, deception, disunion. And I mean, and this is something drawn during that time period, talking about nullification. And I mean, this is what it will eventually come to when we talk, when we get to the Civil War, is states just not agreeing with what the federal government is doing. And that's essentially what's going on here. South Carolina doesn't think the state should be able to write a tariff that isn't good for everybody. Okay, this is one of my favorite political cartoons. So this is Martin Van Buren on Andrew Jackson's back. They're preparing to enter the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. In 1832, when Andrew Jackson runs for re-election, he dumps his original vice president. He doesn't really like his politics and whatnot. And so he's going to take Martin Van Buren, who's also going to be known as the Little Magician, who had, helped him win the presidency in 1828, and have him be his vice presidential candidate. So he's basically, this cartoonist, this artist is saying that Andrew Jackson is bringing Martin Van Buren in on his back. That Martin Van Buren could not have gotten there on his own, that he had to have the assistance of Andrew Jackson. But that's an opinion. It's not necessarily fact, but it's hard to say if Martin Van Buren would have become president if Andrew Jackson hadn't have been a big supporter of his, and he hadn't done successful things to help Andrew Jackson out. So, who knows? But that's, I love that cartoon. Okay. Moving on to the bank veto. So, the first Bank of America in the United States, it does not get rechartered in 1811, but in 1816 there's going to be a panic and all that, so they're going to recharter or charter the second Bank of America in 1816, and it will have a 20-year charter, and so it will be up for rechartering in 1836. Jackson is president from 1828 or 1829 until 1837. He's elected in 28. He does not think the federal government has the right to put together a bank, basically. He does not think it's fitting with what the Constitution has to say. And you will read an excerpt from his actual veto. So when it comes time, they're going to try and recharter the bank early. So before 1836. I think they go in like 1834 maybe? 1833, something like that. The bank's president, his name is Biddle, Nicholas Biddle, I think. He wants it renewed. So Jackson's going to veto the rechartering, condemning the bank as subversive and dangerous to the liberties of the people. Van Buren is elected as VP with Jackson in 1832. So he's supporting that with Jackson. And a lot of people agree with Jackson. All right. Early in 1833, Taney was appointed head of the Treasury Department. So when before they veto it and whatnot, Taney is actually going to withdraw all of the government's gold and silver from the second bank, and he is going to spread the wealth, per se. And so when you pull the money out of the bank collapses. And so that's going to be a problem. In 1836, Jackson does not renew the second bank's national charter, and so that bank folds, along with people who are in charge of it, and etc. So that's one of those decisions Jackson makes that people are on both sides of. Some people thought it was terrible of him to do that. Some people think he was absolutely right to do it, and you'll get to make your own decision on that. So, I think he was right to do it. I think that he is right in saying that that's not the government's money, that it's not the right of the government. But all right, now this is something that is definitely not one of Andrew Jackson's shining moments. The Indian removal. So the white people are demanding more land, and they're going to continue pushing Native people westward. Cherokees were one of the many groups who actually adopted white culture. Many of them are mixed blood, some are slave owners. However, there are several that want to kind of maintain their culture in their ancestral lands. So Jackson's going to stop using federal troops to protect the Cherokee people in the land in the western part of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. So that's going to be his first step, is he's not going to protect these people anymore, even though they have done exactly what everybody has always said they want and needs to do, and that's to assimilate, become part of the white European culture that's going on. 1830, you're going to have the Indian Removal Act, and it's challenged by evangelical Protestants, but it does pass the House. It's a small margin that it passes with, but it does pass. It creates the Indian Territory outside the western boundaries of the states. It promises money and land to those who would give up their lands east of the Mississippi River. There's going to be a lot of violence erupting. Cherokees are going to challenge their removal to the Supreme Court. So there's going to be a Supreme Court case, Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, where they basically say, we shouldn't be removed. We've done everything they've asked us to do. These are our ancestral lands. We're farming them. We're doing, et cetera, et cetera. Many of them speak English. I mean, they're just confused, basically. And the court is going to side with the Cherokees against the state, and they're going to say, you can't remove them. This is their land. Unfortunately, this is one time that Jackson just kind of does his own things. They find this small group of Cherokee Indians who are willing to sign away the rights of the Cherokees. So they're going to sign the Treaty of New Ekita with a small group of Cherokees. And then they'll tell the rest of them, look, we have this signed treaty, so you have to move. And it's going to become this forced removal, and it's going to be known as the Trail of Tears. Approximately 3,000 Cherokee are going to die of starvation and exposure on that 1,200-mile hike to Indian territory. It is going to be quite terrible. So we'll look more into that as well. You can see where the Indian reservations are, the ceded land. All that green is what they remove people from. The Seminoles down in Florida, the Cherokee in Georgia, and Alabama and Tennessee. The Chickasaw, they're all being moved westward. Okay. So Taney, Roger Taney, who was, like I said, a friend of Jackson, and he's going to become the Chief Justice from 1835 to 1864. He is an advocate of states' rights and free enterprise. He enhances the regulatory role of state governments. So, Mayor of New York versus Milne in 1837 rules the state could use police power to inspect the health of arriving immigrants. So, arriving immigrants actually had to go through a medical exam, and if they didn't pass the medical exam, then they were sent back home. Throughout the country, Democrats are going to call for new conventions in 20 states to write new state constitutions. They're going to mandate the election of public officials, justices of the peace, judges, and sheriffs. New constitutions embody the principles of classical liberalism or laissez-faire by limiting the government's role in the economy. And that is something that Andrew Jackson did not believe the government had full rights to do, is control the economy. So he does have long-lasting effects, and I do believe he is one of our best presidents. But he's very contentious. He does some terrible things, the Indian removal being the top of that terrible thing list. But he does start moving our country in a new direction. He gets more people voting. You get more common people, per se, in the elected officials' offices and things like that. And he starts to get away from that kind of hierarchy of wealthy people. And not to say Andrew Jackson was damn wealthy, but he earned pretty much every penny of it. So anyway, that is the end of this section. We got one more little section left for chapter 10, and then we will be done. So have a good morning, afternoon, or evening.